This is the Jackson Neill Sports Podcast. Welcome back to the podcast here on Monday, November 4th, 2019. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today I want to talk about Russell Wilson and make the case for him for being the MVP, because now we're about halfway through, or I guess officially halfway through this NFL regular season, a little bit past halfway. Some of these teams have played 9 games, but everyone's played 8. So I want to make my case. I want to make the case for Russell Wilson. I don't normally do this very often, but I think it needs to be said. Before we jump into that, though, I want to remind everyone that this podcast is available on all of your favorite platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, basically wherever you listen to podcasts, this one is there. Make sure to subscribe so you get the new episodes every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So I want to talk about Russell Wilson and just how good he has been so far this season. Last week, I spent a lot of time on the podcast, every single episode actually, talking about college football, because I think there's a lot going on in college football. Obviously, this upcoming weekend, there is the quote-unquote game of the century between number 1 and number 2 AP-ranked teams in Alabama and LSU. I definitely will be talking about that more later in the week, but I figured I haven't talked about the NFL in just a little bit here on the podcast, so I wanted to dive in and talk about something that I think is really important to be said. Because right now, you're mid-season, you see a lot of the articles with the mid-season awards. People are saying, okay, this is who they think is the bounce-back, comeback player of the year, the offensive player of the year, the rookie of the year, so on, all that stuff. Well, there's the MVP conversation as it comes around every single season. And whereas in normal years, I think it's it's kind of a wide open race. Very rarely is there a player that really dominates. I mean, I think of Tom Brady back, 2007 when the Patriots went undefeated. Last year, Patrick Mahomes, the absurd numbers he put on. But usually there is, a couple players that are leading the pack. And then for the most part, some other guys, it's a wide-ranging conversation. And that's how it's kind of viewed this season, too, is that there's a lot of people throwing around different names. I mean, after last night's huge win over the Patriots, Lamar Jackson has certainly gained a lot of traction in the MVP conversation. Deshaun Watson is up there. Even someone like Aaron Rodgers, even though the Packers didn't have a great showing last evening, I guess you would say, against the Los Angeles Chargers. Rodgers still is in the conversation because of just how well the Packers have been playing so far this year, outside of that one lackluster performance yesterday. But in my mind, there's really a player who is standing above the rest right now. And then I think that maybe just because the stats aren't as gaudy as we've seen before, I'm thinking of Patrick Mahomes, he had 50 touchdowns last season, that we haven't seen, that he's not having insanely gaudy numbers like that maybe he's being forgotten, or maybe because he's playing on the West Coast. I don't really know. But in my mind, Russell Wilson is the clear MVP. That he is head and shoulders above everybody else. That yes, I know someone like Christian McCaffrey is doing a fantastic job for the Carolina Panthers, rushing, receiving, just being that entire team's offense. Lamar Jackson having a great year. Deshaun Watson. All these guys. But Russell Wilson, to me, stands above the rest for a couple reasons. The first thing I think is when I look at a QB and I look at their MVP consideration, I look at the team's record, because you got to come down to that. Because if they're the most valuable player in the entire NFL, that means they're making a difference in the standings. Well, right now the Seahawks are 7-2, and they're second in the NFC West, behind the undefeated San Francisco 49ers, the only undefeated team left. But, still at 7-2. Even if they don't win the division, they're in that inside track to get that wild card spot. So when you look at those numbers, it's like, oh, okay, this is a pretty solid all-around team. But when you dive into it, they're not as good as you would think. Their defense is mediocre to subpar in a couple areas, a lot of areas actually. Yards per game allowed, 25th. The Falcons, that terrible team, they gave up one yard less per game than this Seahawks defense. The Seahawks are 22nd in scoring defense. They give up about 25.5 points per game. For reference, the Washington Redskins give up 24.3, a whole point plus less. And their record is a lot worse than 7-2. And then even look at something like their special teams. The return unit is averaging about 20 yards per kickoff return, which sounds all right, kind of average, but that's 24th. That's kind of in that bottom, right there on the edge of the bottom third of the NFL. Bottom fourth, actually. And what that means is that it equates to worse field position, so that each drive you have is longer than other teams. And I mean, you look at the top of the standings, and you look at, in terms of the wins and losses, then you look at the top of these defensive stats and offensive stats, and usually they kind of align. The Patriots, the Ravens, the Green Bay Packers, these teams, you're kind of all well-rounded teams. Except for the Seahawks. When the people they are around at the bottom of these standings, the teams they're around are the Washington Redskins, like I mentioned, the Atlanta Falcons, the Cleveland Browns. I mean, not great teams. They're even close to the Miami Dolphins in these categories. And yet they're 7-2. Yeah, Chris Carson is having a fantastic year. I mean, 764 yards, about 4.5 yards per carry. He's doing a pretty good job. But when you look at that record and you look at the disparity between where they rank in these defensive statistics and where they are in the standings, I look right at Russell Wilson. And the more I dove into it, the more evidence I found proving that he's having maybe the best season of his career. The raw stats, 68.3 completion percentage, about 2,500 yards, 22 touchdowns to 1 interception, a ridiculous ratio. Scoring TDs and not turning the ball over. Then he has 3 rushing touchdowns on top of that. Then you look at those next-gen stats. I mean, they're kind of funny these days. I mean, like how many miles per hour was this guy running? But there's some of them I put some stock into. Well, according to these next-gen stats, Russell Wilson's completion percentage is actually 7.3 percentage points higher than it technically should be based on how difficult his throws are. That is the third biggest disparity of any QB in the NFL. His average completed air yards, which basically means how far down the field he is completing his passes. Because, sometimes these guys with these insanely high completion percentages, they're just kind of dinking and dunking around the field. Well, Russell Wilson has 7.5 yards. That's 4th. So Russell Wilson is not only throwing the ball downfield, he's doing it with one of the NFL's best completion percentages and with an insane touchdown to interception ratio. He's throwing it down the field far further and more often than anyone else and throwing less interceptions than everyone else. That is so difficult to do. But I think the biggest thing about his MVP case, his biggest thing that Russell Wilson is doing that sets him apart from the rest of the QBs in the NFL is that as of right now, if you could give me any QB and you give me that team, because let's say it's an average NFL team, average offensive line, weapons, running back, all that. But I have 2 minutes to go down the field and score a touchdown or get a field goal to either tie or win that game. Russell Wilson has to be that first choice. I mean, if you go back and look at this past week, he went 53 yards in 6 plays. It took him all of 43 seconds to put his team in position to win that football game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, Jason Myers missed that 40-yard field goal, which is that's a hittable field goal, and yet Wilson still came back and won the game in overtime. So, not only leading 1 game-winning drive in a game, but 2, as long as his kicker just didn't miss a very makeable field goal. And when you look throughout his career, this isn't something that's very different for him. I mean, 28 game-winning, about 27 game-winning drives in his career so far. He started back in 2012, so over the course of the year, he's averaging 2 to 4 of these per season. I mean, it's kind of weird. He's never had a season with 3 of them. It's either, during the regular season, it's either been 2 or it's been 4. So 2 to 4, let's say, per season. Well, this season he has 3 already, and I would like to argue that he should have 4 had Jason Myers made that 40-yard field goal. That is insanely impressive. That shows me that as a QB, his defense is not putting him in positions to win. I mean, they gave up 34 points to Jameis Winston in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense. Yes, there's some weapons on there, but come on, the Bucs offense is definitely not one of the league's best. And yet Russell Wilson still wins the game for his team. That he's being put in difficult situations, and yet he's still able to come through. Look at one-score games. Look at close games so far this season for the Seahawks. They beat the Bengals by 1 point. They beat the Steelers by 2. Beat the Rams by 1. Beat the Browns by 4. Beat the Buccaneers by 6. Falcons by 7. These are all one-score wins. And what that tells me is that these games are going down to the wire. And when the games go down to the wire, each team usually has a chance or two to go down the field and get that go-ahead or tying or just go-ahead score of some sort, whether it's a touchdown or a field goal. And time again, it's Russell Wilson. It's Russell Wilson doing it better than any other of these QBs. It's that he's doing it instead of Jared Goff. Even when his defense gives up 34 points to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, he's still putting up 40. And then the last thing I want to look at, and this is something I always find interesting with QBs, because a lot of times with quarterbacks, you see these pairings, right? I mean, it's kind of classic, the great QB with that great wide receiver. Go through the NFL right now. Aaron Rodgers, he has Devontae Adams. Now, he's been kind of injured, but still, Adams, he has some other solid weapons around there. Deshaun Watson has DeAndre Hopkins. Jimmy Garoppolo has George Kittle, one of the best tight ends in football. Look at Patrick Mahomes, throughout his career, whether it's been Kareem Hunt in the backfield or some other solid running backs this year, but still having someone like Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, just their stable of weapons. Brady, even a guy like him who I consider to be the greatest QB of all time, and I always look at what kind of weapons does he have. Well, at least he has Julian Edelman right now. Sonny Michel's having an all right year. James White's developed into a good pass catcher. So there's still some weapons around there. Well, look at this Seahawks offense. Tyler Lockett is their leading wide receiver right now. Now, I know Tyler Lockett isn't a bum or anything, but wouldn't put him on the level of a Devontae Adams, DeAndre Hopkins, or even really Julian Edelman. Their second leading receiver, DK Metcalf. He's a rookie. So you're relying on a rookie in crucial situations to get you big catches? I don't care how good that rookie is. That's difficult. Even Chris Carson, the running back who's having a solid year, he's not that great of a pass catcher. When you look at their receiving leaders for the Seahawks, he's pretty far down that list. So you take all these things into consideration, and Russell Wilson doesn't really have the weapons even that other people have. And yet he's throwing the ball further downfield than other people, completing it at a high rate, and throwing less interceptions than everyone else while still leading his team to wins with a subpar defense. The only other QB that has considerable weapons to Russell Wilson right now, I think, is Lamar Jackson. Looking around that Ravens offense, there's some talent there, but there's no Devontae Adams, there's no George Kittle, there's no Tyreek Hill. But yet Jackson's MVP case comes down to his legs, not his arm. He's thrown for about 1,800 yards with 12 TDs and 5 interceptions. Nothing close to what Russell Wilson is doing with his arm. So as I look at the Seahawks team, as I look at how much they're basically outproducing, outwinning what they should, the lack of talent around Russell Wilson in skill positions. Yeah, Russell Wilson, in terms of his offensive line, it's a good offensive line. He's had some solid time to throw, comparable to some of the top offensive lines in the league. But does it really matter that much when your weapons aren't that great? Or when your defense is giving up 34 points or is around the level of the Atlanta Falcons, a team who they have a pretty good QB in Matt Ryan, but they're not 7-2. They're nowhere close. Or the Washington Redskins, a team who's giving up less points per game than your team is, and yet you're a complete 180 in the standings. So when you consider these MVPs this year, I don't see how anybody besides Russell Wilson is a choice. The guy is having a career year. He's arguably the best quarterback in the NFL right now. If it's 2 minutes left and I got to win the game, if it's 43 seconds left and I got to get halfway down the field to set up a winnable field goal, makeable field goal, I'm picking Russell Wilson, and I think the stats support that, and I don't know how close of a conversation it is, especially this season. And with that, that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Jackson Neill Sports Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Coming up later in the week, I'm going to hope to have some guests on the show, especially to talk about that Alabama-LSU game in college football, maybe some more NFL and NBA. A little boring hearing me talk for only me on this podcast. I'm going to try to get some fun guests. Had some great ones on last week. Bill Bender of Sporting News, Chris Hummer of 24/7 Sports. If you didn't hear those episodes, I know we talked, maybe they're a little dated after this weekend's results, but still some great conversations from last week. So go back in the feed and check that out if you want to. And also make sure to rate and subscribe to this podcast. Rating it really helps the podcast grow, and subscribing, make sure you get the new episodes every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Now, for more episodes of this podcast, my music discussion podcast, as well as my interview series, Anything Goes with Jackson Neill, all 3 of my podcasts, go over to guess where, jacksonneillpodcast.com, making it pretty easy on you guys to guess. There I publish every episode to all 3 of my podcasts. All the archives are there as well in case you missed an episode. Now, if you're a really big fan of the show and maybe you want to consider becoming a subscriber over on Patreon, over there it's this cool platform that lets you for either $1 or a couple dollars a month support the podcast and get access to bonus content from this podcast right here, bonus sports segments, bonus music segments, and bonus questions from my interviews on Anything Goes. I write, record, produce, do everything for these podcasts myself as a full-time college student, so the extra little support just helps me spend more time making these fun episodes. If you want to stay up to date on everything I'm doing, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at JacksonNeil20. Today's music is by Analog by Nature with their song CDK Sunday. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you all next time.